Good evening. Oh, you can do better than that. Good evening. Welcome to the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection. My name is Adam Hamilton. I'm the senior pastor here, and we're so glad that you're here with us today. I know some of you are regulars here at Resurrection. Some of you are visitors. If this is your first time, we're so grateful that you came. One quick announcement: women's restrooms are outside that door and that door up there. Men's restrooms are outside that door and that door over here if you need them. And as we begin, I'd like to begin with a word of prayer. Would you bow with me? Open our ears to hear and our hearts to receive, oh God, all that we can receive from this conversation. You know, this is such a hard topic and one that Americans have been divided over for more than 50 years. Most of us, have pretty firm opinions and sometimes very strong opinions about people who might hold views other than our own. We pray, oh God, that you might help us to listen, to hear, to understand why people hold views different than our own. Help us to discern your will. And we pray that you would guide and lead us, that when we're finished with this conversation, we might better love you and love our neighbor. We ask all these mercies and blessings in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, this is a conversation we're going to have this evening that is a really critical one, we think. A critical one, and one that, again, is something that Americans are deeply divided over. And as we have this conversation, my hope and prayer is that it's a conversation, an opportunity for us to listen and learn. James tells us this, that we are to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And it's really, and you've heard this before, but we have two ears and one mouth in direct proportion to the way that God wants us to use them. And so our hope is this evening that you'll be able to listen and hear. We are trying to bring in, or we've tried to bring in voices from different places in the continuum of how we think about abortion. And we have, in preparation for this, taken a survey of our own congregation and anyone else who happened to get the survey online. And we had we had exactly 4,393 people who took the survey last time I looked. And I thought we might just start by taking a look at a little of that survey data to give you an idea as to where people are sitting in this room. And how many of you took the survey? Most of you did. Good. So this is your data. It's not mine, it's yours. And so I want you to be aware of that. I want to show you that data, but first I want to just let you know where we're going to be heading. So we are going to begin by hearing from a OBGYN who's going to help us understand the biology from conception to birth. So we learned that in high school. We probably need to relearn it and remember what's happening and what looks like, what's happening at various stages of fetal development. We are going to then hear from two people who hold very different opinions about abortion. We're going to hear from the spokesperson or the director of communications for Kansans for Life, and we are going to hear from the CEO of the Great Plains Planned Parenthood. And they're both going to come to us by video. I had a chance to interview them in person last week, so we'll have a chance to hear from them. Following that, we're going to have a chance to hear from a highly respected federal judge, district court judge, who is going to, U.S. district court judge, who's going to help us understand what was Roe v. Wade about, what happened as a result of Dobbs, and then what's going on in Kansas and what's the legal status there. We're going to hear from a Kansas legislator, former Kansas legislator, who is going to help us think together about what legislators do and what regulations are already on the books, and then to help us understand what could happen and what legislators can do when it comes to passing laws related to abortion. Following that, we're going to hear from another medical doctor, gynecological oncologist, who is going to help us understand first birth control and how does birth control work, and then she's going to help us understand medically indicated times where abortions are necessary. And so we're going to understand a little bit more about that. Each of them are going to have about 10 minutes to be able to share their views, or not their views, but their data with us. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk a little bit about faith and abortion and the kind of conversations that people have. The data from the survey, we had 4,393 people take it. 77% were women, 23% were men. There was just a few that indicated other. 66% of those who took the survey attend church weekly. So this is a pretty religious lot that indicated, took the survey. And there was another, altogether, 87% of survey respondents attend church here at least 2 or 3 times a year, some of them monthly, but a large number of them every week. And then we had folks, 13%, who either don't go to church anywhere or they go to some other church, not this church. When I looked at the numbers of people who took it and where they came from, 66% live in Kansas, 17% live in Missouri, and then we had 41 other states represented in the survey. We had, of the people who took it, there were, 52% were baby boomers, 33% were younger than boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. 14% were older than boomers. They were from the silent generation. The people who took the survey were nearly equally divided between Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And that was interesting. Independents are a bit lower, and depending on whether you were male or female, there were more men who were Republicans who took it and more women who were Democrats who took it, and about double the number of independents from the last time we took a survey like this. So let me just show you a little bit of the data from this, if you guys give me the iPad. So one of the questions we asked is, how firm are your current views on abortion and abortion policy? And 58% of you said, I am very confident in my views and they are unlikely to change. So most of us are pretty set in what we think about this issue. 37% said, I am somewhat confident in my views, but willing to reconsider as I learn more. 4% said, I have some viewpoints, but I'm very open to change. And 1% said, I have no firm stance. So we pretty much think we know what we believe about this. We have pretty strong opinions about this. Let me show you a little more data. How firm are your current views on abortion policy? Now, this is divided by female and male, so we'll notice that women have pretty strong opinions about this. Men, not quite as strong, but still pretty strong on our views. But notice the 62% among women. So let me just back up here for a second. Actually, take that off the screen if you would, and I just want to talk to you and look at your faces for a minute. So part of the assumption that I'm making, and I think it's a valid one, is that when it comes to abortion, it's not quite as much of a black and white issue as we often think. That we talk about a binary choice. You are pro-life or you are pro-choice. But when you start asking people to dig a little deeper and you start providing them with a little more information, you begin to find that most people are somewhere not on the ends, but somewhere closer towards the middle. And so we gave you 13 possible choices on the survey for where your position would best be described. And I just want to share with you, I'm not going to tell you what all of these are at the moment. I will kind of give you some sense of this, but let's take a look at the slide if you would. So of the 13 positions, this is where you all came out. Now that doesn't mean much to you, except right now I want you to notice is that the only place where there was not even a majority, but the highest number was number 7, which I'll tell you what it was in a minute. 23% said that's my place. So from this side over, we're talking about people who say, either I think abortion is completely wrong in all circumstances, even to save the life of a woman. That's over here at 1%. And over here is the 23% is people who say, I believe abortion is wrong, but I don't believe I should be legislating that to other people. So all of these people would say, I think generally abortion is wrong. In this case, they would be willing to make an exception for the life of the mother. In this case, it's for the life of the mother, rape and incest. In this case, it's life of the mother, rape and incest, and fetal deformity. In this case, it's all of those things plus a woman's mental health, severe mental health. And I don't remember, I'm sorry off the top of my head what this one was here. As we start moving this direction, we find I started putting sort of timelines. So, and again, you can only choose one, so people might have wanted to choose more than one, but this starts over on this end with, I believe abortion should be legal at any time in the pregnancy, all the way until birth. And I think many of these people didn't necessarily, well, I don't know, I can't say what they were thinking. This says at fetal viability. So 14% said, I think it should be a woman's legal right up to fetal viability, which has been at the beginning, Roe v. Wade had at the beginning of the 3rd trimester. It's actually medically gone back just a bit from there. And then we have these other indicators are when there is EEG activity, brain activity, regular brain activity here. But what I want you to notice is that very few people on this are at the far ends. Most people find themselves somewhere migrating this way. And these people are really on both sides. These people are saying, let's make sure it's legal and safe but rare. But personally, I think it's not right. But I'm not going to tell somebody else that. All right, so that gives you some idea of where the people are sitting in this room. Does that surprise you at all, or did you think most people were one place or another? So maybe for some of you, a little surprising for some that sets where you think you thought it would be. So then I look at this timeline and again, or this spectrum, and I think for many of us, we've been taught that you are pro-life or pro-choice. But what we saw here is that most people are pro-life, but there's exceptions, or pro-choice, but I don't believe it all the way to the time that somebody's born. So we're somewhere in this middle ground. And part of what I'm hoping for tonight is you're not going to hear me say this is how you should vote on August 2nd. What I do hope is that you better understand people in different places and you understand the issues, and that we might look to see, are there places we can agree, even as we disagree? And you're going to vote, and you're going to decide what to do with your vote, but are there places where I can actually, with my neighbor who has a different sign in their yard than I have, say, I love you still, and I bet we agree on some really important things. So that's where we're heading today. All right, I'd like to invite Dr. Michelle Lintel to come forward, and she is going to help us. She is a OBGYN. She had a practice with over 5,000 patients who are part of her practice. She is going to help us walk through embryonic and fetal development. Dr. Lintel, thank you so much for coming today. Great to see you.
So good evening. I am tasked tonight with, as Adam said, an overview of embryonic and fetal development. We're going to start first with some pregnancy terminology so we can kind of set the stage for how do we date this. We hear a lot about weeks and when do weeks matter and at what week something should matter. So we'll just talk about how do we date the pregnancy. And there are a couple of ways. One is called gestational age dating, and this refers to the length of pregnancy after the first day of a woman's last menstrual period, and is usually expressed in weeks and days, and this is also known as the menstrual age. So a pregnancy, if you date it this way, lasts approximately 280 days or 40 weeks. The more accurate dating is from conception, which is 2 weeks after the first day of the last menstrual period. It's just we don't always know when conception is, so we date from that last menstrual period. So there's also conceptual age, and like I said, that's the true fetal age. It refers to the length of pregnancy from the time of fertilization or conception. And so when it's 2 weeks later, that's an average of 266 days or 38 weeks. The other couple of terms I just want to mention are miscarriage and abortion, because in the medical field, they're often used interchangeably. So if you'll hear a miscarriage clinically, we talk about a spontaneous abortion. That's what a miscarriage is. But there are other forms, and we're talking about elective or induced in that circumstance this evening. But a spontaneous abortion or miscarriage is defined as the loss of pregnancy less than 20 weeks gestation, and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists estimates it's the most common form of pregnancy loss. It is estimated that as many as 26% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage, and up to 10% of clinically recognized pregnancies. So that means there's a number of them, a good percentage, that happen when they've not even been diagnosed as having a pregnancy. It's just that early. The next couple of terms, we'll talk about the stages of prenatal development. The first 2 weeks after conception are known as the germinal stage, and then the 3rd week through the 8th week of conceptual age, so following fertilization, that's called the embryonic period. And if you were dating gestationally, that'd be the 5th through the 10th week. The fetal period begins at the 9th week until birth, again, conceptual dating, and at the 11th week until birth with gestational dating. So in the first couple of weeks, if we're doing gestational dating, the woman's not actually pregnant. So week 3, or the first week of conceptual age, that's when fertilization occurs and creates a one-celled entity known as a zygote. And conception typically occurs in the outer 2/3 of the fallopian tube. And I don't have a pointer, and this is the only slide I would have asked for one, but you can see in the upper right-hand corner, it kind of points to that outer 2/3, and that's the most common place for conception to occur. That is the zygote. The zygote begins to divide and becomes what's called a morula as it makes its way down the fallopian tube towards the uterine cavity. By 6 to 10 days after fertilization, it becomes what's known as a blastocyst and burrows into or embeds or implants in the uterine lining called the endometrium. By 3 to 4 weeks after conception, or 5 or 6 past, known as the gestational age, the embryo begins to change from a flat disc to a curved C-shaped form, The neural tube is beginning to close, which will eventually become the brain and spinal cord. Small buds appear that will become arms eventually. Organs begin forming. The heart starts as a tubular structure. The embryo at this point is only about 6 millimeters long, or 1/4 of an inch. During weeks 6, 7, and 8, gestational age, or again, conceptual age 5 and 6, the lower limb bones make their first appearance. They'll become the legs eventually. The head and face are growing, kidneys begin to form, and the umbilical cord joins the embryo and the placenta, which is also known as the afterbirth. Prior to this point, the pregnancy has been sustained by what's known as a yolk sac, and now it's from the placenta through the umbilical cord. The embryo is about 11 to 14 millimeters long, or 1/2 inch. In weeks 9 and 10, elbows, toes, and eyelids form. The umbilical cord is visible by ultrasound. Essential organs, including the basic parts of the brain and heart, are now formed. They have a lot of growth yet to do, but the basic parts have formed. The embryo is about 31 millimeters, or 1 1/4 inches long. Weeks 11 and 12, the main body parts are formed and present, and the embryo at the end of this time is called a fetus. The ears move up and around the neck to their normal position. Intestines are fully in the abdomen, and various glands begin to work. At this point, measurements are from the crown to the rump of the fetus, and the average of about 61 millimeters, or 2 1/3 inches. And weight is approximately 14 grams, which is under 1 ounce. We'll just review some highlights of the second trimester. At this point, the fetus will develop further the facial features. The eyelids, eyebrows, eyelashes, nails, and hair are formed. Teeth and bones become denser. Fetal movement is usually noted between 16 and 20 weeks. The nervous system begins to function. If born prematurely, the baby may survive after the 23rd week, with weeks of intensive care to follow. By the end of the 6th month, the fetus is about 12 inches long and weighs about 2 pounds. From a gestational age point of view, the end of the second trimester is 27 weeks. So from 27 weeks on is the third trimester, and during this time, the fetus gains weight quickly, adding body fat. The brain develops rapidly at this time, and the fetus can now see and hear. The lungs complete their final maturation, but the lungs aren't fully mature typically until the very last few days of pregnancy. The final slide I have just simply represents an overview of what we've talked about, of prenatal development, the first, second, and third trimester, when we reach viability, and what is known as preterm and term pregnancies. Thank you.
That seems important as we're talking about the questions of abortion, to be able to understand what's happening in fetal development. As the fetus continues to grow, as it moves from an embryo to fetus, the development is happening really rapidly. And so you see that in what you've just heard from Dr. Lintel. And the question, if you are pro-choice, is where do you stop? Where do you say this is where we think this is not okay, or it's morally problematic to be able to have an abortion? Roe v. Wade had said that happens at the third trimester. At the third trimester, the states could regulate abortion, whereas previous to that, they could not. And so anyway, this is an important piece for those who are pro-choice to be able to say, but where am I pro-choice? And where do I say this is problematic? And generally speaking, most people say, and most ethicists say, that if you are looking at abortion, the longer you wait, the more morally problematic that is. And so by the time you have a fetus with what may be consciousness in the later third trimester, that becomes even more morally problematic. So anyway, those are things I just wanted you to have in your mind as we're talking about what we're talking about. All right, I'd like for us to take a few moments to listen to the spokesperson, the communications director for Kansans for Life. She also works and helps with the campaign for Value Them Both. And her name is Danielle. And Danielle is she's here in Kansas City. Danielle Underwood. She, prior to going to work for Kansans for Life, was working with an organization in Kansas City that helps disabled children and tries to help schools and others be able to mainstream them into their schools. And I found her to be a delightful person. I asked her if she could come in and we could sit down and talk together for a little while. Each of these interviews that I'm going to share with you was in total about 30 minutes, and you're going to get 5 minutes. And what we try to do is find the most salient, most important 5 minutes. And so I want you to hear from Danielle Underwood.
I joined Kansans for Life in 2021, right after learning that Kansas had found itself in a situation that we needed to correct an overreach decision on the part of our Kansas State Supreme Court that really removed the voices of Kansans from the conversation about the appropriate limits for the abortion industry. And so with that being a very particular mission, and a moment I felt like I was called into that moment, and I answered yes. And so that's what brought me here to this moment, having these conversations in a place I never expected to be. But here I am, and I'm happy to have this conversation with you today. So your question really has to go back to the situation that led us here. Because this amendment is a response of the people to a situation we felt needed correction. In 2019, our Kansas State Supreme Court issued a ruling. It was in regards to our live dismemberment ban that had been passed in our legislature out of strong support among Kansans, that we did not want that procedure happening in our state. And in that ruling, they, shockingly to almost all Kansans, came forward with this ruling that made abortion to be essentially unlimited and unregulated in the state of Kansas. And I know that we've had people who have questions about that. But in the ruling itself, it says that all laws pertaining to abortion are presumed unconstitutional. And that's also been referenced as recently as June in further legal action that the abortion industry has been taking to try to push back and overturn our laws that Kansans had joined together in support to make sure that we had some common sense limits in place in Kansas on the abortion industry. What people need to realize is that we're looking at things right now under a current conditions lens. But this process started 3 years ago, before we had any of the things happening at the national level that we're seeing right now. And so the amendment itself is very, very simple. All it says is, do the people of Kansas have a say in the kinds of limits that we place on the abortion industry or not? Those are the two choices before Kansans. Either we have a limited abortion industry or no limits on the abortion industry. That's what the wording of the amendment says. And we've seen tons of misinformation that has been really just rampant throughout our state. And we need to make sure that people understand what they're truly voting on August 2nd. Those are the two choices: no limits or common sense limits that we agree to through consensus. Without that, we have no ability to place or keep any existing limits. The laws we have on the books are truly just sandcastles. They will not stand they will not withstand any legal challenge unless we pass the Value Them Both Amendment on August 2nd. Most of us do not want third trimester abortions happening in our state. That is something that there is broad consensus among Americans and even more so among Kansans, that we don't want that happening here. But that will not meet that strict scrutiny standard. And we know that the abortion industry is they have, first of all, fought against every single one of the limits ever proposed, including the parental involvement, the parental notification. They've fought against the taxpayer funding. And we also know that they have fought against those later term limits. We also know that all existing Kansas laws right now provide for the protection of the life of the mother. So anything that they say that says that we are somehow removing that right is not there in the language of the amendment It is absolutely not there, and it has never been shown to be the case that Kansans would seek to remove those kind of protections from women. If anything, the reason it's called Value Them Both is because we want to protect both women and babies from the abortion industry. There have got to be some common sense limits that we can agree on, that we come together as Kansans, use our democratic process, elect representatives who will carry that message forward and do what we tell them we want them to do. So if we can do that, then we are at a place where Kansans can continue having discussions. And if not, then we will be excluded from that kind of decision-making process in our state. Well, the first thing I want to tackle is I want to make sure that people understand that the wording of the amendment is technically abortion neutral. Yeah. It does not remove exceptions for rape, incest, or the life of the mother. Yeah. Read the language. Make sure that you educate yourself about what you're truly voting on. And don't get swept along with the misinformation saying that it's a ban on abortion, because that is false. You need to read the language and know what you're actually voting on. All those signs saying, stop the ban, that is not the amendment. It is truly abortion neutral, because if we don't pass this amendment, what we will have forced on us is a state where we have unlimited, unrestricted abortion in our state. And that's because all of those laws will be sued and struck down on that standard that the Kansas Supreme Court put in place in 2019.
All right, so that's Danielle Underwood, and I so appreciated her coming in and having a chance to listen to her, and I learned some things and I saw some things differently than I had before I had a chance to talk with Danielle. I want you to have a chance to hear from Emily Wales. Emily Wales is the CEO of the Great Plains Planned Parenthood, and prior to that, she was their general counsel. She is a graduate of Harvard Law School, and I had a chance to drive up to Kansas City, Kansas, and sit with her in the Planned Parenthood clinic there, as she explained to me a little bit more about why she got involved in this work and how she sees this issue. Take a listen.
So I actually came to Planned Parenthood through my dad, who is a Presbyterian minister. And I grew up thinking it was very normal to have a father who went to session on Monday and choir on Tuesday and Citizens for Choice on Wednesday. My dad graduated from seminary in '73 and actually had some friends in high school who sought illegal abortions. One person that he was fairly close to passed away from an illegal abortion. And it was just part of my upbringing that I think to ensure that every person had a level of dignity and healthcare and the right to make decisions about themselves, that choice was a part of that. So not a lot of people come to this work through your faith, but for me, when I went to law school, I either wanted to work for legal aid or work for reproductive rights, and I found one path to be pretty compelling, and so here I am. I knew that I wanted to help people who were low income and low resource. And for many women and families, the ability to make your own reproductive choices is how you set yourself up economically. It determines so many things in your life. And I think, for my dad in particular, he was really involved with domestic violence at our home, church and within our community. And over and again, it was people felt compelled to go back to an abusive partner because of children or because they couldn't economically survive on their own. And so giving people the ability to make those choices was really important. The majority of our patients are low resource, low income, but also the majority are parents, and they're often making decisions thinking about their other children, about their families, what's best for them. The majority of our patients are a little bit older. They're actually mid-20s to mid-30s. The majority of them are already parents, and they are struggling with whether or not they can keep a pregnancy because of complications. They may be the victim of violence. Our team sees many, many people who are not in a position emotionally to keep a pregnancy. And then there are other people who don't share their reasons. And at the end of the day, our team is there to ensure that people understand all of their options, whether that's parenting or adoption or abortion care. But we also believe patients and think that they can make the best choices for them. The people who are experts in this care, from the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, American Medical Association, our physicians take their guidance really from those sources, but then we have to layer in additional requirements from the state. When you provide abortion services or advocate for abortion services, especially in our part of the country, it comes with, I think, a level of scrutiny and risk. and a feeling that you are often the only person who is there to listen and guide and support patients. Our team members come because they have sometimes been impacted by abortion, or because they have seen how hard it is for their family and friends to get care, and they're really motivated to lift up and listen to others. We never want a patient to leave feeling like they weren't valued and supported and heard. And sometimes by the time they get to us, between state requirements, possibly people in their lives, community, shame, or judgment, they feel really isolated. And they also feel convinced that they have made the decision that's best for them. Private providers and hospital systems have relied on the few remaining providers to serve their patients. And I think we're seeing, as we look at Missouri or Texas or Oklahoma, private providers there are struggling to figure out what is legal, what is not, who takes the risk, where do I refer patients? And they're frustrated that maybe they can't provide care in their hospital system, but also they can't now say, okay, you can go half an hour away. Instead, the answer is, do you think you can get to Chicago? Could you take 3 or 4 days off of work? Abortion providers have been isolated for a long time, and you do the work because you care about the patient. There's not a lot of glory in this work. Yeah. I come at this analysis as a lawyer. I mean, it's how I see the world. And I think it's an incredible thing to say that you want to keep the status quo by amending a constitution. You don't change a state's constitution in order to keep things the way they are. And that is what so many of the talking points from the other side of this campaign are saying. We do have regulated abortion. The Hodes and Nauser decision has been years ago at this point, and you don't see abortion accessible everywhere. You don't see abortion past 22 weeks, which is the state ban. You do see judicial bypass requirements for minors and 2-parent consent that remains in effect. You do see state mandated consent. We provide healthcare that should be regulated like other healthcare, but it's not. And there's no part of changing the state's constitution that will make care safer. I think we have to be realistic that what the other side wants and has advocated for is an end to abortion access. And that is real. It's really happening in other parts of the country. And Kansans, I hope, will see that. This is not sort of a dystopian projecture of what might be coming. It is possible, and it is coming if we don't keep a protection.
What I wish I could do right now is have you turn to each other and talk about these two sides for about 30 minutes, but we don't have time for you to do that. And I was a little afraid of what would happen if I did turn you loose on each other. But I think it's helpful to be able to hear and actually see and get to know what motivates people where they are and how they view the same circumstances differently. And this is what we see. And of course, and you're smart enough to know, you see the signs, I get the texts. The texts that I get are the alarmist texts about the worst possible thing that could happen, and they're sent out by people on both the right and on the left, and the reality is not nearly what we see in the postcards we get in the mail. And so what I'd like to do is to invite Judge Julie Robinson to come forward to share with us and help us understand Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision that overturned it, the 2019 Kansas Supreme Court decision about abortion that has in part led to the value of the Both Amendment. And I asked Judge Julie to join us. She's a founding member of Church of the Resurrection. She's one of the most respected judges in the system. She is a senior judge of the U.S. District Court for the District of Kansas. She was nominated for that position by President Bush in 2001 and confirmed by the Senate later that year. And Judge Julie, if you'll come and help us understand the legal side of all of this.
Good evening. Well, I am here as a so-called subject matter expert on the law, and I hopefully am here to educate you on what these decisions say and also what the current state of the law in Kansas is. Frankly, after hearing from these two speakers, I'm reminded that there's misconceptions on both sides of this issue as to what the law is, so hopefully I can clarify some things to you in that regard. I should say I'm a sitting federal judge. I'm not offering opinions, I'm not offering viewpoints, I'm not allowed to do that. I have a very limited First Amendment right. I can only speak through the decisions that I make, not talk about politics or policy or even issues. So, as you know, this year the United States Supreme Court handed down an important decision in the Dobbs case. And the Dobbs case, the United States Supreme Court departed from precedent. They overruled the Roe decision that was handed down in 1973. They overruled the Casey decision that was handed down in 1992. In the Dobbs decision this year, the Supreme Court ruled that there is no right to abortion, no constitutional right to abortion under the U.S. Constitution. Now, the Dobbs case is a case in which someone filed a lawsuit challenging a Mississippi law that banned most abortions after 15 weeks. And so they challenged it under the U.S. Constitution, so it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, for the first time, said there's no constitutional right to abortion, and if someone's going to bring a challenge to an abortion law under the United States Constitution, the test that the state must meet is to establish that the law has a rational basis concerning a legitimate state interest. And I don't know if that has gone up on the slide, but we can bring it up later. Now, just to give you some background, as you'll recall, in 1973, the Supreme Court had the landmark decision in Roe that said there is the constitutional right to abortion under the U.S. Constitution, and it was that decision that set up that 3-trimester framework. They gave that framework to courts and said that when states are regulating abortion in the first trimester, the decision should be left to the woman and the judgment of her medical provider. In the second trimester, the Roe court ruled states may restrict abortions as long as it's in ways reasonably related to maternal health. And then in the third trimester, the Roe court said, once the fetus is viable, states may restrict abortion and even prohibit abortion, except where necessary in appropriate medical judgment for preservation of life or the health of the mother. So that was the Roe case. The Roe court held that abortion was a fundamental right under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. This is the basis for a number of other rights that have to do with personal autonomy, the right to marry outside of your race, now the right to marry in the same sex, the right to make decisions about your family. So that's where the underpinning of what the Roe decision was about. So with that framework in mind, after the Roe decision, the states responded by continuing to enact limitations, restrictions, regulations, prohibitions on abortion. They had done that before Roe. In fact, there have been laws on the books in many states that date back 200 years. But after Roe, states started legislating, and Kansas did as well. 19 years after Roe, in 1992, the Supreme Court had another landmark decision in Casey. It was a case about a Pennsylvania law that was challenged under the U.S. Constitution, and a number of provisions of that Pennsylvania law were challenged in the Casey case. And in that case, the Supreme Court reaffirmed its ruling in Roe, saying, yes, there is a constitutional right to abortion under the U.S. Constitution, but different standards should be used when reviewing laws that restrict that right before the fetus is viable. So the Supreme Court said, we're not going to hold the state to as strict a standard, we're going to hold them to a lesser standard that's called the undue burden test. So if a law restricts abortions before viability, the state has to show that the purpose or effect of the law was not to place a substantial obstacle in the path of the woman that was seeking the abortion before viability. That was the Casey case, 1992. Now in 2022, Dobbs has overruled both Roe and Casey, saying there is no right to abortion under the U.S. Constitution, and the test for courts to review regulations of abortion when challenged under the U.S. Constitution is the rational basis test. So, after the Casey decision in 1992, states continue to legislate, regulate, and restrict abortions, as is their right. As you know, every state is its own sovereign government. Every state has the right to enact its own set of laws. Every state has its own constitution. So, after the Casey decision, Kansas, like a lot of other states, continued to legislate in this area. As we sit here today in 2022, Kansas has a number of restrictions that are the law in Kansas, they're enforceable in Kansas, and in fact, with one exception, none of these laws have been challenged. The only way really to challenge a law restricting abortion or a law of any sort is to bring a lawsuit to challenge that law. And with one exception, and that's the Hodes and Nauser decision, which I'll talk about shortly. With that one exception, none of these laws that are on the books in Kansas and that are still good law and still enforceable, none of them have been challenged, even though a number of these laws have been on the books for a long time. The next speaker is going to go in more depth, I believe, on what the current Kansas statutes are that restrict and regulate abortions, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. I'll just hit a few high points just so you're clear, because I do think there's a lot of misinformation about what is legal and what is not legal in Kansas. So, abortions of viable unborn children are prohibited in Kansas, but there is an exception. And that exception is if it's necessary to preserve the life of the woman, or if continuation of the pregnancy will cause a substantial and irreversible physical impairment of a major bodily function of the woman. And when they say a function of the woman, they're talking about physical impairments, physical functions, not mental, not emotional. There's not an allowable exception to this law for emotional or mental problems. So abortions of viable unborn children are prohibited in Kansas. That law has been on the books since 1992. No one has brought a lawsuit to challenge it to date. In 2011, the Kansas legislature passed a law prohibiting abortions of pain-capable unborn children, which the Kansas legislature said was at the 20-week mark. That law has not been challenged. In 1992, we had the Kansas legislature pass the parental consent provisions for minor abortions, the 24-hour waiting period that requires a lot of information be provided to the woman before she may receive an abortion. That's been on the books since at least 1997. None of those laws have been challenged. And in 1998, the Kansas legislature passed a law prohibiting partial birth abortions. And it's a crime for abortion providers to provide a partial birth abortion as defined in that statute. No one has challenged that 1998 law. Also, I'll note that in 2011, the Kansas legislature passed a law that declared that it does have, the people of Kansas have a compelling state interest in protecting the lives of unborn children. And in 2013, the Kansas law passed a law that life begins at fertilization. So those are laws all on the books, have not been challenged. There has been one legal challenge, and the speakers that you heard from earlier spoke of that. So in 2015, the Kansas legislature passed a law which prohibits the use of dilation and evacuation. That's a type of abortion procedure called D&E. Again, with a medical exception, that exception being when necessary to preserve the life of the pregnant woman or to prevent substantial, irreversible physical impairment of a major bodily function. So that was passed in 2015. In 2016, very quickly, that law was challenged. Two doctors brought a lawsuit. They filed it in Shawnee County District Court, which is a trial court in the state of Kansas system, challenging that particular prohibition of that particular procedure, not challenging any of the other laws that I've already spoken of. So the lawsuit was filed in Shawnee County District Court. I'm going to drill down a little bit and tell you a little bit more specifics about this procedural posture of that law, because again, I think people don't understand what the procedural posture of this litigation is, and I think both sides have misrepresented to some extent what's really going on in the case. So these two doctors challenged the law by filing this lawsuit in Shawnee County District Court. The trial court entered a temporary injunction. That's not that unusual. It happens sometimes in certain types of lawsuits. So effectively stopping the law from going into effect until the litigation could reach its conclusion. So the state of Kansas appealed that temporary injunction. It went all the way up to the Kansas Supreme Court. The Kansas Supreme Court issued a very important decision, and I'll talk about that, but the decision at that stage just meant that it's going back down to the trial court. The Kansas Supreme Court upheld the temporary injunction, sent the litigation back to the trial court, and I'll tell you what happened next. But in its decision, the Kansas Supreme Court said two things. One, there is a right to abortion under the Kansas Constitution, Because you see, this law was not challenged under the US Constitution. This lawsuit was challenging it under the Kansas Constitution. So the Kansas Supreme Court said there is that right in the Kansas Constitution. It said the right is not unrestricted. It says the state can restrict the right. It can legislate and restrict the right, but there is this constitutional right under the Constitution. So what that Supreme Court was doing is it was interpreting the Kansas Constitution, which is not identical to the US Constitution. And I will say to you, if you're a history buff of Kansas history, you might want to read the decision. There's a very thorough discussion of the Kansas Constitution and what that court thinks that the drafters of the Kansas Constitution intended about this topic. There's also a very lengthy and thorough dissenting opinion, which of course has the opposite conclusion, that also goes through a very thorough analysis, if you're a nerd and you want to read that sort of history stuff. But in any event, the Kansas Supreme Court said there is a right to constitution under our Kansas Constitution, and secondly, when the state restricts it, as they can, courts, judicial review is to employ the strict scrutiny test. That's the same test that the Supreme Court had used back in the Roe decision, but now with Dobbs, first with Casey, now with Dobbs, they're using a less strict test. So the Kansas Supreme Court did say they're to be reviewed under the strict scrutiny test. Then it sent the case back to the Kansas trial court. That's where it went. Then the case went forward in litigation. For those of you that have ever been involved in a lawsuit, you know what that looks like. There was discovery. Both the state of Kansas and the plaintiffs developed their evidence, and then they filed motions for summary judgment. The trial court in Shawnee County has now ruled on those motions for summary judgment, and that ruling, the state of Kansas has appealed. Now let me tell you what that ruling is. The ruling is, by the trial court, because the state of Kansas has to prove two things under this strict scrutiny test. First, they have to prove that the state, in legislating this law, has a compelling state interest. And secondly, they have to show that the restriction, the law itself, is narrowly tailored to achieve the compelling state interest. So what the trial court in Shawnee County said was, Kansas proved that there is a compelling state interest. And I'm going to quote specifically from that trial court opinion. It says, quote, Kansas proved that, quote, there is a compelling state interest in promoting respect for the value and dignity of human life, born and unborn, unquote. All right? So on that part of the test, the trial court found that Kansas met its obligations of showing that. But the trial court found that Kansas had not proven the other part of the test. Now, the trial court was relying on evidence because the litigation had gone its whole route. And the trial court concluded, based on the evidence that that court heard, that Kansas had not proved that this particular law that prohibits the D&E procedure, with the medical exception, of course, was narrowly tailored to achieve the interest, the compelling state interest that Kansas has in born and unborn lives. Now, you may be asking, okay, so what does all of this mean? What is a compelling state interest, and what is narrowly tailored? And I mean, how do courts go about interpreting that language that's been handed down from the Kansas Supreme Court? Well, first of all, the Kansas Supreme Court says a compelling state interest is one that is extremely weighty, maybe urgent, and not rare. And then it also says, when you talk about something having to be narrowly tailored to achieve the purpose of the statute, that just means the statute shouldn't go any farther than it needs to achieve that compelling state interest. So anyway, the trial court heard evidence, and on that narrowly tailored piece of it, which it said Kansas had not met its burden of proof, the trial court talked about some of the evidence in its written opinion as to why Kansas hadn't met this second part of the test. The trial court found that this D&E procedure is the most commonly used procedure for abortions in the second trimester at the 14 to 15 week mark. Now, the state of Kansas didn't argue that there should be no abortions at the 14 to 15 week mark. It argued that there were other reasonable alternatives to this particular procedure. And there was evidence presented on both sides, of course, and the court found that there were no other reasonable alternatives. One of the alternatives that Kansas had advocated for, the court found there had been no studies regarding the efficacy and safety of that particular type of procedure. Another alternative method Kansas suggested, the court found there were increased risks of infection, and there was risk of uterine rupture and other medical complications. And then the only other alternative would have been a hysterectomy, which the court found would not be a reasonable alternative. Now, that trial court's ruling, it's back to the Kansas Supreme Court for review. So that's where we are in Kansas today with the Hodes and Nauser decision. The trial court has found that the state did not meet its burden to prove that that particular law is narrowly tailored to achieve the important, the compelling state interest that it recognized. And the Kansas Supreme Court now is going to review the trial court's decision. That's where we're at. And also where we're at is that all of those other laws that have gone unchallenged are still good law in Kansas. Will they be challenged? I don't know. You don't know. They'll only be challenged if someone files a lawsuit and challenges them. And a court cannot give advisory opinions. So when the court rules, let's say, on one particular restriction, that does not mean the court's ruling on any other restrictions. The only way to challenge any of these restrictions is to file a lawsuit on that particular restriction. And so far, despite all of these, most of these restrictions being on the books for many years, a number of them dating back to 1992, nobody has filed a lawsuit to challenge them. The strict scrutiny test, you will hear legal commentators say that the strict scrutiny test that the Supreme Court used to apply in Roe and that the Kansas Supreme Court applies now is a very strict test. You will hear legal commentators say that it means the state's always going to lose. If a restriction is challenged, if that's the standard to be applied, they're always going to lose. Those same legal commentators will tell you that if the rational basis test is used, the state's always going to win. In other words, no matter how restrictive or what the regulation says, if it's the rational basis test, the state's going to win, the regulation's going to prevail. What I will tell you is no matter what the test is, when a court is reviewing a challenge to legislation, the court has to carefully consider what is the regulation, what is the restriction, what does the law say? They have to apply the required test. The courts do not say, well, I'm under the rational basis test, that means the law is going to be upheld, or I'm under the strict scrutiny test, that means the law is going to be rejected. That's not the way it works. And I can give you examples. For example, in the Casey test, or in the Casey case, which was an undue burden test back in 1992, there were multiple provisions that were challenged, and the Supreme Court upheld most of them under that test, but struck down one of the Pennsylvania provisions. So each one that is challenged is looked at separately and individually, and that's something the courts have to do. So that leaves us with where we're at today. If you can put the proposed constitutional amendment up, I'm not going to read it to you. Like the speakers have said, it is important that you read this and understand what it says because words have meaning. But I will say that if this constitutional amendment passes, here's what will not change. Kansas will still be able to legislate restrictions, prohibitions on abortion, just like they all have. It does not take the power away from the state to do that. What does change is the standard of judicial review. So if this amendment does not pass, the standard of judicial review under Kansas, challenges the Kansas Constitution, will be under the strict scrutiny test. But Kansas will be able to continue to restrict and to legislate. And unless the laws are challenged, the courts don't get involved. We don't give advisory opinions. If the amendment does not pass, Kansas will continue to be able to enact and restrict and to regulate. The laws that are on the books now, of course, will remain in effect, as they will if the amendment passes. So I just wanted to give clarity to that. You will hear, and I'm not going to opine on this, but you'll hear people say, this is what's going to happen if the amendment passes, here's what's going to be passed or not passed, here's what's going to happen if the amendment doesn't pass, here's all of the challenges that are going to be brought. I mean, that's speculative, frankly. We don't know. But as I've stressed before, most of these laws have been on the books for years and no one has seen fit to challenge them at the lawsuit yet. Of course, they may later if they choose to. And the Kansas legislature can continue to adopt more restrictive laws if it chooses to, because that's the power they have. Now, there's a bill that was introduced just this year in the Kansas House Bill 2746. It's just an example of a more restrictive law. It's a bill. It hasn't been passed. It may not be passed. It may be passed. But this particular bill, if it's passed, would criminalize the performance of any abortion in Kansas, no matter the gestational age, because under this law, life begins at the moment of fertilization. That's what the bill says. And so any abortion, there is an exception to save the life of the mother under this bill as well. This bill also, if passed, would criminalize the destruction of a fertilized embryo that happens in the process of artificial insemination. So I think we all know from watching around the country, all of these states are going to continue to legislate, as ours will too, probably. What that will look like, we don't know. What we do know is that our elected officials will decide whether or not to pass a bill. That's the power that we gave them when we elected them to office. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I want to ask one clarifying question if I could. So if Value Them Both passes, there is not a constitutional guarantee in the state of Kansas for an abortion, for a woman's right to abortion. If it doesn't pass, that continues to be in effect. And I heard you address it, but can you just say again, does that matter if it's, you mentioned that we can pass legislation either way. So what difference would it make if if this passes and it's no longer a part of our Constitution in Kansas?
The difference is if the amendment passes, there will be a much less strict standard of judicial review on any restrictions that are challenged in a lawsuit. If the amendment does not pass, the standard will remain the same as to what the Kansas Supreme Court has already said, the strict scrutiny test. And I kind of walked you through how the trial court applied that when they got the test back from the Kansas Supreme Court. But the Hodes case isn't over, so it's another round of appeal.
Okay, thank you so much.
All
so
right.
Appreciate you being here tonight. We're going to talk about this from a legislative, we've heard from the judicial side, we're going to talk about this from a legislative side. Stephanie Sharp was a state legislator in Kansas from 2003 to 2008. She was a trustee at Johnson County Community College from 2009 to 2017. In 2011, she started a firm helping those running for office to connect with their constituents. And I love this phrase, translating politics into English. And I've asked her to come and help us understand the state legislator's role in surrounding abortion and what statutes currently on the books, that are currently on the books, and how this change, if Value Them Both passes, will affect that. So Stephanie, if you'd come, and Stephanie's also a longtime Resurrection member. Welcome, Stephanie, thank you.
For those of you that follow the Kansas legislature, I'm an unlikely speaker today. This isn't an issue that I was known for. I wasn't a reliable vote for either side of this issue, but as an elected official in Kansas, it's certainly an issue you need to know front and back. As Judge Robinson just so eloquently discussed, the 2019 court case interpreted a right to abortion in the Kansas Constitution and struck down the bill banning the D&E procedure. Since the court said that ban was unconstitutional, the legislature sought to change the Constitution. But not by putting a ban in the Constitution, but by stating the legislature has the sole purview to write abortion law, removing judicial review and legal challenges altogether. So why now? Why August 2nd, 2022? A quick civics refresher. I know we've gone through biology class and law class, and now we're going to go on to civics. Constitutional amendments must achieve a 2/3 majority in both the Kansas House and the Kansas Senate before they are placed on the ballot for the public. Regular bills, just a regular bill in the legislature, must pass the Kansas House and the Kansas Senate, and then are sent to the governor's office for her veto or to sign the bill. constitutional amendments skip that last step and go straight to the public for an up or down vote. Most issues that rise to the constitutional amendment level are deemed urgent enough to place on the soonest election. However, this was written to be on a primary ballot more than a year away. Why? Odd year elections like August and November of 2021 are nonpartisan and elect local offices like your school board and your city council. There are no party affiliations and everyone is eligible to vote. Even year primary elections, on the other hand, are party affiliated and only those affiliated with the Republican or Democrat Party can vote in the party primary. These party primary elections narrow the field of candidates so one Republican and one Democrat face off in the November election. If you are an unaffiliated voter voting in a primary, you can change your party affiliation at the poll when you go to vote, or if you don't change your party affiliation, you will only see questions, city questions, school board questions like tax issues, things, for example, and constitutional amendments and elections for nonpartisan county commission, but only if there are enough candidates in that race to qualify for a primary. In Kansas, Democratic Party and county commission primaries are pretty rare, so Democrat and unaffiliated voters just aren't used to going to the polls in August. In the August 2020 election, for example, Johnson County saw 34% turnout and 30% in 2018. As a Republican who ran in primaries with 20% turnout, I think 34% sounds pretty good, but I digress. Low turnout, party-affiliated elections, primary elections, are much more effective and efficient to influence because you're targeting fewer fish in the barrel. In addition, the timing is attractive for candidates who are supportive of the amendment to benefit from an activated electorate. Placing a constitutional amendment on the August primary ballot made a lot of political sense. Placing a constitutional amendment on the November ballot, when turnout reached 77% in 2020, would have gained the input of many more Kansans. I want to thank Corps member, former Representative Jan Kessinger for his courageous efforts in 2020 to force the amendment on a November election to ensure more Kansans had a voice. The effort failed in 2020. Representative Kessinger was defeated that August, and the 2021 legislature added the amendment to the August 22 ballot. So that's the why now. What about current law? The legislative history of abortion is literally rewritten every single year when the legislature convenes, with dozens of bills introduced every legislative session. In fact, abortion laws currently on the books are not impacted by the 2019 decision. You will still have abortion banned after 22 weeks. A 24-hour waiting period following the initial appointment at an abortion provider is still required. You will still be required to receive state-written counseling on abortion alternatives as well as a fetal ultrasound. All Kansans under 18 are also required to have parental consent notarized by both parents prior to such a procedure. Administratively, you will still see bans on state funding of abortion. Those remain intact. The only way that you would ever see a state-funded abortion is if a state employee, for example, who's on the state healthcare plan, has an abortion required to save her life. And then finally, health and safety protocols are still required in terms of federal and state healthcare requirements. And at the state level, those facilities are required to meet ambulatory surgery center health regulations. As we've seen above, the legislature has always and will continue to write laws on abortion. But as of now, it must pass constitutional muster if challenged. The constitutional amendment removes that check and balance of the courts. So now let's look at the amendment language. I'm going to give you all a chance to read the actual language. And Judge Robinson also had a slide on this. We're overlapping a little bit. And if you take a minute to read through that language, I know a lot of you have already read it, the language infers the legislature will protect women in dire circumstances because rape, incest, and life of the mother are specifically listed. Amendments were proposed during the debate on this issue in the legislature. Amendments were proposed to add these specific exceptions into the Constitution and into the language of the amendment, but those were voted down in favor of giving the legislature this broad authority. The critical wording here is may pass. I'm going to do a quick audience engagement. How many lawyers or government affairs professionals do we have in the audience today? Raise your hand. Okay, you know where I'm going with this. You already know where I'm going. Anyone who's worked around legalese knows the vital difference between may and shall. And politicians know that most folks don't know the difference. Okay, how many parents do we have in the audience? You're a parent? Okay, this is how I like to explain. Again, this is translating politics into English. Imagine telling your kiddo, you may pick up your room now. Now imagine telling your kiddo, you shall pick up your room now, right? This language very intentionally uses may and leaves the rest up to the legislature, meaning they may not include those exceptions as well. I say that shall is the mom voice of the law. When I started in the Kansas legislature 20 years ago, this year, it was common to hear bills to render in vitro fertilization illegal because it produces more embryos than are intended to be carried to birth. Other bills sought to recognize most types of birth control as abortion because they prevent implantation of a fertilized egg, as discussed by Dr. Lintel. Still others would grant personhood protections upon fertilization. And that was 20 years ago. After everything that we have learned today, regardless of where you stand on the issue, let's talk quickly about what you can do now. Number one, learn who represents you in your city, your school, your county, your state, and your federal legislatures. Vote411.org is a great resource for this. And also for Johnson County specific information, check out votejoco.com. Make contact and offer your professional and personal expertise as a resource for your legislators, for your elected representatives' work. Your relationship with them is much easier. It is a lot easier to make that ask of your legislator when you've had a relationship with them than when you just come in cold and asking for something. I call it the can I borrow some flour for my cake? If you're moved into a neighborhood and you haven't spoken to your neighbors in 2 years, and now your kid comes and they need brownies for tomorrow's class, but you need a cup of flour, how awkward is that conversation? Where if you've built a relationship with that neighbor, then you ask for the flour, it's not a big deal. Same thing with your legislators. Develop that relationship before you need it. Learn about candidates' positions on the issues that are important to you. Again, those 2 websites I just mentioned, and there will be QR codes up on the screen. In line with Resurrection's kindness campaign, pay attention to how candidates treat each other and how they treat the public. Research candidates via these websites and others where they answer questions from the public and those who don't, because not filling out surveys also tells you a lot about a candidate. And finally, vote. When 34% of us turn out, it only takes 17.01% to win. So when a small minority of the electorate votes, an even smaller part of the electorate makes the rules for the remaining 80% of us. As you saw in Pastor Adams' data from the survey, most of us agree on a lot of this. We just have to get out and vote for it. I've been a member here at Resurrection for more than 20 years, and I'm grateful to Pastor Adam for convening controversial conversations on this and other hot-button issues where our community can learn all sides of the issues in light of biblical interpretation as well. Thank you all for your time today.
All right, at this time, I want to turn to two different topics that are related to this discussion. One has to do with birth control, and we've heard that there are regulations that some would pass related to birth control. IUDs in particular are often lifted up as something that is seen as an abortifacient. Birth control pills, some have suggested that that should be outlawed. Most, I think, don't think that that will happen in the Kansas legislature, but I do want us to understand, how do they work? How does birth control work? Birth control pills and IUDs. And then I also would like us to understand the morning after pill. This is a question that also will come up in legislation in the coming years, that one in particular. And I've asked Dr. Brenda Shoup to come forward. She's a highly respected gynecological oncologist in Kansas City. She's also the spouse of one of our pastors, Glenn Shoup. And I'd like for her to speak first to those questions around birth control, and then she's gonna help us understand as a physician, when are there times that a doctor has to make a decision about whether there is a termination of a pregnancy, either for the child's sake or for the woman's sake. So would you join me in welcoming Dr. Brenda Shoup?
I feel like I've been to law school, and now we're moving back to medical school for a little bit. So the first thing is birth control pills. Their mechanism of action is not primarily an abortifacient. They act on several levels of the pituitary and ovarian axis to prevent ovulation. They inhibit this by suppressing the pituitary gland from triggering ovulation of the egg out of the ovary. They also, because of the hormonal concentrations in the blood, prevent the egg from actually going through the maturation phases that make it amenable to fertilization. It makes fertilization and implantation both unlikely. It also inhibits sperm from penetrating the cervical mucus because the progesterone in the birth control pill makes that mucus much thicker. The area where people propose that it's an abortifacient is that the lining of the uterus becomes thinner and less amenable to fertilization or implantation. So it actually has several mechanisms, the least of which is the thinning the lining of the uterus. Intrauterine device they've had many forms over the years, but the most common forms now are kind of a T-shaped device. One is covered with copper, and one is impregnated with a progesterone or a hormone. The primary mechanism of action of the copper IUD is actually inflammation in the uterine cavity that's spermicidal. It probably does prohibit implantation in some cases, but that is not the main mechanism of action. The progesterone IUD also thickens the cervical mucus and helps prevent sperm penetration into the uterine cavity. It also creates an inflammatory process in the uterine cavity that is spermicidal, and it thins the lining of the uterus that prevents implantation. The morning after pill, controversial. It's a single pill of progesterone that is 95% effective in preventing pregnancy if taken within 24 hours, but even up to 72 hours after unprotected intercourse or even failure of current contraceptive device. And it acts the same way that birth control pills act, in that by creating a high level of progesterone actually can delay ovulation enough to prevent actually the sperm and ovary from meeting together, the sperm and egg from meeting together. And it changes the maturation of the egg so that it's less susceptible to fertilization. It may inhibit implantation, but once implantation has begun, it's not effective in disrupting that. So those are kind of the three birth control mechanisms of action that I was asked to talk about. I'm going to move now to medical indications for termination of pregnancy. And these are very difficult clinical scenarios because these are most commonly wanted pregnancies that, as a medical professional, we have to at least offer them termination of this pregnancy for various reasons. And I split them into two different segments. One is fetal indications and one is maternal indications. The fetal indications, certainly there are genetic abnormalities. Some are incompatible with life, and others cause severe deformity Those can be initially hinted at by a blood test on the mother at about 10 weeks, but has to be confirmed typically by amniocentesis, which is about 15 weeks. So you're already beyond the 10-week stage. Structural abnormalities can occur without genetic abnormalities, and these can be just severely deformed embryologic phases, even absence of normal brain, things that are often incompatible with life or compatible with severe disability. Ectopic and abdominal pregnancies have been talked about a lot recently in the press, and what that is when, as Dr. Lintel pointed out, fertilization occurs in the tube and then is transported into the uterus, but sometimes that goes awry, and it can actually implant in the fallopian tube or, in even rare cases, in the abdominal cavity. These are not viable pregnancies and actually pose a significant risk to the mother because of hemorrhage, rupture of the tube, and they have to be either treated medically by eliminating the pregnancy or surgically by removing the pregnancy. They can sometimes have a fetus. I personally have taken care of an ectopic that was at the 15-week stage. So they aren't always little tiny embryos. Molar pregnancies are also abnormal pregnancies, and it is when there's genetic abnormality from the fusion of the sperm to the egg. This actually creates abnormal placenta that can sometimes actually be malignant. It can metastasize to other parts of the mother's body and actually be lethal. They can sometimes have fetus within the molar pregnancy, so you can sometimes see actually a fetus with a heartbeat, but they are not viable pregnancies. They need to be treated either with surgical removal or medication to end the pregnancy. I also thought it would be worthwhile mentioning embryo reduction for high-order multiples. With the advent of reproductive endocrinology, I know you've heard of pregnancies that can have 9, 10 babies within the womb. That is a significant health risk to the mother and to all the other embryos. So offering them selective reduction is part of the list of medical options that should be offered to those patients. Moving on to maternal indications for termination, severe cardiac, pulmonary, and renal disease. I mean, some women who get pregnant already have severely compromised cardiac function, and when you carry a pregnancy, the load on the heart is increased significantly, and some women just cannot tolerate that. It would be a significant risk to their life. So offering them termination of a pregnancy is definitely within the list of things that should be discussed. Trauma and abruption, this can occur, motor vehicle accident, a baby that is pre-viable, bleeding that's causing the mother's life to be in danger. Certainly removing the pregnancy to stop that bleeding is warranted. Malignancy is something we see as an oncologist. Oftentimes when people are pregnant, they go to their first OB visit and they get a pap smear. They haven't had one for many years, and this is when we diagnose cervical cancer, sometimes in early pregnancy. Sometimes it's advanced cervical cancer, and those women need to be treated before the delivery of a term pregnancy. So sometimes termination of the pregnancy is warranted and should be offered in those cases. Some hematologic malignancies that need high-dose chemotherapy that would be lethal to early pregnancy, that can occur as well in young women. Infection, the placenta, the amniotic fluid, that can become infected with bacteria. If antibiotics don't work to treat that, the mother can become septic, and there's really no other way to treat that other than removal of the pregnancy. And this can happen really at any gestation. Toxemia of pregnancy is typically occurs late in pregnancy. It's also called preeclampsia or eclampsia, but it can occur in pre-viable gestations, even at 20 weeks, where the mother can come in severely hypertensive, have a stroke, and die from the pregnancy, and it's the only treatment for it is to remove the pregnancy. So if you have someone that sick who's pre-viable, it's absolutely indicated to be able to remove that pregnancy so the mom can get better. And then psychiatric indications, this would include, this is not my area of expertise, but certainly incest, rape, or severe psychiatric abnormalities that may make the medical community and the patient want to discuss the option of termination of pregnancy. I do feel compelled to say tonight that there's a lot of anxiety about the future of healthcare for pregnant women among people who take care of these women. The medical decisions that we've discussed are never easy and they're never straightforward, and they often have to be made within hours to days by the patient who just got bad news and by the doctor who's trying to weigh all the options and present the facts to the patient. Legal decisions often can go on, as we have seen, for years to decades. This fear and anxiety among the medical community, I worry, will cause a delay in care for women or even prevent access to for some women altogether. I'm very appreciative of all of you tonight who took time out of your schedule to educate yourself on this very complicated issue that's not straightforward. Thank you.
Really grateful for each of our speakers tonight, and I want to share a few final closing thoughts with you in the next 10 minutes. Will you join me once more in thanking them for coming out and preparing? I can tell you just coming to speak in front of a group of people about this is anxiety-inducing. And even as your pastor, I feel anxiety about it. And just because I know we're in such different places, and abortion evokes such strong emotions for us on either side. And so it becomes very hard unless you're strongly on one side. There are churches who are telling their people, this is how you should vote, this is what you should do, and making that part of their liturgy and their worship. And we don't do that here. But we do talk about issues like this because they're important. There are both pastoral components to this and moral components to this and biblical components to this. So I want to have a chance to talk with you about some of those things. One of the slides I wanted to share with you, which I think is rather interesting, is we asked you this question. When thinking about the underlying ethics of love and compassion, do you consider your own stances to be more or less loving and compassionate than the opposing view? And two-thirds of you, nearly two-thirds, 58% said my position is more loving and compassionate than the other side. And because you were all over the map, that means both pro-life and pro-choice people feel this. And 41% said it's equally loving and compassionate. Nobody goes out there and says, what can I do that's the most unloving thing to do? Or how can I do something that's against God's will? If you're a Christian, you are trying to do God's will. And you are trying to understand what God would have you do. And so people on both sides, if they're people of faith, are saying, I think based on my understanding of what's going on in this situation, this is the right thing to do. This is the moral thing to do or the ethical thing to do. And part of what we recognize is there's a tension when it comes to this ethic. When it comes to abortion, we feel a tension. And the Value Them Both side has tried to capture that in the statement of Value Them Both. It's a brilliant title to use because that's what we need to do. We need to value them both. There is something to understanding that, and to moving away from thinking, and not that any of you do, but that the fetus in the womb is just so much tissue. We just can't let ourselves say that about the development of a human life. It's some people want to tell me, well, this is a human being from the moment of conception. That's not how I see it. But I do see it as a potential human being, that the longer you allow this to go is going to develop into a human being. And we can't just dismiss that and say, well, that's no big deal. We have to be serious about the ethics of looking at what happens in the developmental process of an unborn child or a fetus. And so I appreciate Michelle Lintel helping us to remember that. And I spent, probably 15 hours a couple of weeks ago refreshing myself on every step in that process and then looking to see, the pictures of every month in that process and what's happened and what's developed at this period of time. And again, it just reminds me, this is something we cannot just simply dismiss and say, this doesn't matter. So we have to care about unborn children and the development, the fetal development process. And we have to care about women who are carrying children that for whatever reason they did not intend to have at that time. And there's a wide variety of reasons. And when it comes to ethics, we often argue things from the extremes. So on the one hand, we argue that this is about rape and incest. And of course, that's an issue, but that's a very small slice of the puzzle. But it's still real and it has to be talked about. And, and on the other side, the idea that people want to have abortions at 8.5 months. And that's just, if you look in the Kansas, what's happened in Kansas, the records are kept, I think since 1992, I looked back, and nobody's had an abortion in the 3rd trimester unless there was a woman's life endangered since that period of time. So we throw that out there as an argument for the side that we have, but it's something nobody's really doing because nobody wants to wait until the 6th, 7th, 8th month to have an abortion. It just doesn't happen very often. There's sometimes conversations about those who are pro-choice as though they're advocating for abortion. But I've not yet met anybody who says to me, I think abortion's an awesome idea and everybody ought to have 5. Most people say this is a really complex and complicated issue and there are women who are facing something really hard and difficult and I have compassion for them and I don't want to see them die in a backroom abortion, or I don't want to see them in a place where, their life is wrecked because of this. And this week, so in the survey, we asked if you've had an abortion. So we had 4,400 people take the survey. 25% were men, 23% were men, 77% were women. And there were 448 women who'd had abortions. And last night I stayed up as long as I could to read all of their stories because there was a place in there where I said, if you're willing to share your story, would you please do that? And I fell asleep with my computer on my lap on my back porch at like 1:30 in the morning trying to read all of those stories. And some of them were just heartbreaking. And there were some of them, I was going to read some of them to you, but I'm just going to try to summarize this. There were some of them who said, I had an abortion and I really regretted it the rest of my life. And there were some of them who said, I'm so grateful I had the legal access to an abortion because my life was a mess. I remember people describing being married to abusive husbands. And the only way out of that marriage was not to have the baby, and they were afraid of bringing a baby up in a home with an abusive husband and already having 2 or 3 children. I was speaking I went and interviewed the staff, several of the staff, and a volunteer at the Advice and Aid Pregnancy Center at 109th and Row. And it's right across, so the parking lot backs up to the Planned Parenthood parking lot. And so their doors face each other. And I sat down with them, to listen. Tell me about the women who are coming in here. And of course, some stumbled in there thinking it was Planned Parenthood, and they told them, and that's part of the strategy and being right across from each other. But they told them, we're not Planned Parenthood, and if you're looking for an abortion, that's not what we do. And they were very upfront about that. But what struck me was their compassion for the women who came in, and they said most of the women who see us are poor. And we have undocumented women who know that they'll be sent back to wherever they came from if they have a baby and they're in the hospital. And others who they described others who, they said most of these are not, 16-year-old teenagers from Blue Valley High School. Not that aren't some of those that come in, but these are typically women who have 1 or 2 children already, or maybe 3, and they're trying to figure out, I can't even feed my own family right now. And if I take off work for 3 months and I now have another baby I got to pay for childcare for, how am I going to do that? And so Advice and Aid Pregnancy is, of course, hoping not to, women would choose not to have an abortion, and their aim is to say, we want to show people that there's support and we can help you and we can care for you. And I think that's a really laudable thing. If you're pro-life, you should be looking to see, how do I help women who feel like there's no other choice? Because if you feel totally optionless and this is one way out, then, if you're pro-life, help with that. That's, I think, really important. And I'll share with you in a few minutes, one of the volunteers who was there who's a member of our church, a longtime member of our church, and what she does and how she tries to help people. But listening to these stories, and then listening to some who said, I almost had an abortion, and then in the last minute I chose not to, and how grateful I am that I have this child, who is now mine. Or, we decided to get married and we had the baby. And here's what I can tell you. There's no 2 stories that were the same of the 448 stories that I read. And I wanted to cry for so many of them. And when we simply, look at this issue and say, well, it's just a cut and dried issue. You're going to kill babies if you have a morning after pill or you have an abortion in the first trimester, you're killing babies, but you're not thinking about the woman and her life. I think it's a miss as well. We have to value them both. And the question for, you as you're looking at value them both amendment is, does it value them both? And that's for you to decide. But I do think we have to understand, and the reason why you saw so many people on our survey who were, I think it's wrong, but I won't make this anybody else abide by my morality or my thoughts, or people in our congregation who said, I think up to a certain point a woman should have the right to choose this, is because they have been with women who were in very difficult places. And I think to myself, I've been with people, sat and listened to people, and some of those difficult situations, these are rare, but they happen, with people who had a child who was missing part of their brain, and this is discovered very early on, or they were gonna suffer, or there was gonna be, and I've never given advice to somebody to have an abortion, because I will tell you my position has always been I'm pro-life with a heavy heart. And the heavy heart means that I have compassion for people who are walking through really horrible things, and thinking, there may be situations that I don't fully understand, but that might merit or might call for this. But I don't ever give advice to somebody to have an abortion. If it was somebody who was disabled, I tell them the story of Matthew Joyner. If a baby's not fully formed in the womb, because Matthew Joyner is in the stained glass window, his Ann's doctor said, this is a life not worth saving. And she had the baby, and he started Matthew's ministry here, and he was here for 20 some years of his life. It's complicated. And most of us are not on the extremes. Most of us are trying to find some, if you're pro-choice, almost every pro-choice person I've talked to has said there comes a point at which this is not okay. And I don't know exactly when that is, but maybe when the baby can live outside the womb, or maybe when there's a heartbeat, or maybe it's when there's there's brain activity. But at some point, I'm not comfortable with the thought that we should be, taking this step. But up until that point, I think this may be really critical for someone. Both sides think that they're being more compassionate and more loving than the other side. I want to share with you just a couple other things on here. We asked if you believe that abortion should be legal. So these are what we would call pro-choice people, but it's probably not a great terminology. But for those who believe abortion should be legal, which of the following measures would you support? I believe the state should provide Medicaid funding for abortions for low-income people. So 52% of pro-choice people said that, and that we would expect that perhaps. In non-emergency cases, I support a required period of 24 hours after an initial consultation before abortion is performed. That's considered a pro-life position. But 48% of pro-choice people said, I think that's probably smart to give women a chance to think about this and pray one more time and again consider if this is the right thing to do. Others would say, no, that's just putting a roadblock in the way of somebody who's already hurting. In non-emergency cases, I support required counseling with a woman seeking an abortion regarding fetal development and options to abort. 50% of pro-choice people said that they supported that idea. 50% did not. I believe those under 18 should be required to have parental notification before an abortion is performed. 43% said, I think that makes sense. Now, here's what I know, is if I brought someone up who was describing what it was like to tell a parent who was abusive that they were gonna have an abortion, you might change your mind. But absent that story, it makes good sense. And my point is only that there are places that we can meet. And again, for pro-life people, most pro-life people, only 1% of pro-life people said, I believe so strongly that abortion is murdering a child and that we can't possibly sanction that they said even if the case of the mother being harmed, potentially dying, I still support not having an abortion. So most people are willing to say, I think in these situations, well, I'm gonna add a little bit, in these situations or in these situations. So we find ourselves, even those who are pro-choice, 45% of our people, or pro-life, 45% of our people said either I'm not comfortable legislating my morality for somebody else or telling someone else what they must do because I'm not walking in their shoes, or saying I think there are certain places where we need to make allowance for abortions. All right, so I wanted to mention just a couple of other bits of information, then I want to share with you a couple of final thoughts related to faith and scripture. When it comes to abortions, last year in Kansas, because there's a report that's issued every year, last year there were 7,849 induced abortions that were reported in the state of Kansas. You may have seen signs that next year, if this value of them both doesn't pass, we'll have 78,000 abortions in the state of Kansas. And the concern that comes out of actually a report from Guttmacher that people don't have access to abortions in a lot of other states and they're gonna have to come here. These would not be Kansas abortions, and I don't know if that number is accurate or not. But if you look at the folks who are having abortions, the age in Kansas, the vast majority were in their 20s, and the second category were people in their 30s. And so again, not typically teenagers or younger adults under 18. As we look at that, we find that the vast majority of those abortions occurred before 9 weeks. And so these are occurring very early in the pregnancy. And the problem today is that you might be looking for an abortion, but you might have to wait 2 or 3 weeks in order to be able to have one, which seems problematic because you're forcing people to wait longer and allowing that fetus to develop even further. All right, so here's a couple of things I want to share from the faith perspective. So what does Scripture say about abortion? And abortion was known in the ancient world. There were ideas as to how you could abort a child if you found yourself pregnant and you were afraid to be pregnant. And that included eating certain herbs. It included certain vigorous exercise. There were a whole host of things that were written up as here's what you would do if you find yourself pregnant and you're not prepared to have a baby. But we don't find the word abortion mentioned anywhere in the Bible, except I think it's used once with regard to Paul when he's telling his testimony. And he said, I became a Christian as one untimely born. And I think the Greek word there is the word that was used for abortion in the first century. But otherwise, we don't find the word in Scripture. We don't find Jesus addressing this particular situation. But we do find ideas in Scripture that are important for us to consider when we think about the value of the unborn. And so we find John the Baptist is a great example. While he's in the womb, he's filled with the Holy Spirit and leaps for joy. Now, obviously, he's moving. This is after quickening. But, this is the idea that somehow the Holy Spirit was already at work inside the womb. Jesus' birth is itself the result of the Holy Spirit forming him in Mary's womb. I think about Isaiah 49:1, where Isaiah the prophet believed that the Lord called me before I was born, while I was in my mother's womb, he named me. Or Jeremiah 1:5 says something similar. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. And I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Paul in Galatians 1:15 says, God set me apart before I was born. And so there was this constant idea that God is somehow working in the womb and shaping us in some way. That doesn't tell us whether first trimester abortions are wrong or right, or the morning after pill is okay. It just tells us that the idea was that in the womb, God was already at work. Psalm 139, many of you know these words, you created me in my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All right, so there's scriptures that point to that inside the womb, God is at work, and there's some, that this is, a human that's developing, even if we don't ascribe personhood to a zygote. I'm wandering all over the map just a little bit, but one of the analogies that often happens when you have a fertilized egg, and some people say, well, life begins at conception. Well, the sperm was alive too. And so was the egg, it was alive too. And every one of your cells in your body is a complete complement of your DNA. And so, yes, this is a living zygote, it's a fertilized egg. And then it begins to divide, and you've got the morula and the blastula or the blastocyst, and then finally it implants in the uterus. And pregnancy really, many people say, technically begins about the 7th to 10th day when the blastocyst implants in the uterine wall. So I have I have a number of friends who are Jewish rabbis, but a couple of them have written about this recently, and I've had conversations with them. And within their strand of Judaism, there are two different denominations of Judaism, if you will, and they point out that there is a difference in the Torah between a human who is born and a human that is developing in the womb. This is in Exodus. And if there is, the law that if you kill somebody, you're put to death. But if you do something to harm a fetus, there's a fine that you pay. And so within Judaism, they say there's a difference in how we look at the unborn versus the born, even though in most of Judaism, there is a opposition at some level to abortion. There's a recognition that there's some moral problems there, some challenging moral issues that are involved in abortion. Often the debate is postured as when does life begin, or when should we ascribe personhood? And it's interesting within Christianity, as Christianity developed, this question was asked: when is the baby? Well, this was the question: when does the baby get a soul? So when does the baby get a soul? What's the answer to that? Does it have a soul? Is there a soul at the zygote or the blastula, or when does the soul? And where is the soul anyway? And so people who try to think hard about this think the soul seems to be in the brain. Seems to somehow reside or be connected very strongly to the brain and consciousness. And so when does that happen? And so the early church, not knowing about fetal development the way we do, although there were spontaneous abortions or miscarriages, they knew something about what a baby looked like in the womb, many of them said it happened at quickening. So quickening was when the woman could feel the baby. And they said as soon as she can feel the baby, God has given the baby a soul. And so this is how it was looked at in some places. I don't know if that's the right answer or not. I just want you to know that there's been a lot of thinking about this over a long period of time. And this is one of those questions, is exactly when. And they were kind of doing the same thing for different reasons, trying to understand when is this, a viable life that Roe versus Wade was trying to do when it was asking the question about when is abortion allowed and not allowed. Okay, a couple of last things I want to mention. I wrote this book like 10 years ago, maybe longer. It's about 14 years ago, a book called Seeing Gray in a World of Black and White. And it talks about a whole host of issues and how often things are not nearly as black and white as we think they are. And as I was looking at this issue in particular, I thought it was worth noting that, again, not only most people see the gray in this issue, but they also recognize the sense that this is an issue, this is a moral issue about which we need to have conversations. And I was thinking, I wanted to share with you just a little bit from this chapter. And then I want to close with it in just a moment more. So I was struck by this quote as just kind of one picture of what some answers might be. So most people think that abortion should be less frequent. So a man named William Sletton, in January of 2006, so this is right before the book was published, in an op-ed piece in the New York Times, he was pro-choice, but he said abortion is bad. The ideal number of abortions is 0. That abortion generates moral friction. Most people will tolerate it as a lesser evil or a temporary measure, but they'll never fully accept it. They want a world in which it's less necessary. And I think he might have overstated it, because if it's an abortion to save the life of another human being, it becomes a good. It becomes something that is necessary. But one of the things I thought was interesting is, what could we do to reduce the number of abortions? And so 46% of women who had abortions at that time had not been using birth control. So, I find it interesting, some of the most adamant people against abortion are also people who refuse to support birth control for a variety of reasons. What would happen if birth control was made free and accessible to anyone? Would that help? And there are a whole host of other things like that we might agree upon and say these things are places where we can find some common ground. My personal view was always, let's make abortion as rare as possible. And I think we could do that if we could work together, as opposed to being on opposite sides of a fence trying to fight against one another. All right, so here's some places I think we agree. Pro-choice advocates and pro-life advocates each have legitimate concerns. I think that seems reasonable. Abortion is both not ideal and yet occasionally necessary. At the very least, most pro-life advocates would say to save the life of a mother. Decreasing the number of abortions in America would be desirable. Adequate information about and access to birth control can help reduce abortions. The longer a pregnancy progresses, the more morally problematic it is, and no one should be pressured into having an abortion. And if an abortion occurs, it should be safe. I think most people would probably agree with that. All right. So I wanted to share with you the United Methodist position on abortion. And this is in our book of resolutions. I don't think it's in our book of discipline, but our book of resolutions. And it says this: our belief in the sanctity of unborn life makes us reluctant to approve abortion, but we are equally bound to respect the sacredness of the life and well-being of the mother, for whom devastating damage may result from an unacceptable pregnancy. In continuity with past Christian teaching, we recognize tragic conflicts of life with life that may justify abortion. All right, I want to introduce you to someone who I think, she spoke to me this week, I'll just tell you that. And her name is Cheryl, and Cheryl she's one of our members, she works at the Advice and Aid Pregnancy Center. And I went in there with a lot of conceptions about what this might be like, a crisis pregnancy center. And then I met this beautiful Resurrection member who talked about why she does what she does. And I thought you might enjoy hearing a little bit from her. Take a listen.
At Advice and Aid, we often get women who come in our doors who are, in their mind, in a crisis. They're in a pregnancy they didn't plan. They're full of fear and anxiety. You can see the burden just almost on their shoulders when they come in their face. And I'm a client advocate there. I've been one for about 9 years now. And what I do is I have the opportunity and the privilege to take those women and sit down with them and discuss with them why they've come to us. And they, let me know why they're there, and to listen to their story. They often want to tell their story. They probably haven't told their story to maybe anyone else, but they feel safe there. They don't feel condemnation. They have acceptance, I think, and so they can tell their stories to us. Then I can offer them a medical grade pregnancy test. I can offer them a sonogram, which will give us information about their baby. It will let us know if the baby is in the uterus. It'll let us see and hear the heartbeat, and we can measure the baby and know the baby's age. And the woman is a part of that and sees all of that too. We talk to these women about the options that they have when they come to us. When you're pregnant, you have 3 options. You can carry the baby and parent it. You can carry that baby through birth and look at adoption, or you can go towards terminating the pregnancy through abortion. That's your 3 choices. And we are there to give them information about any one of those areas or any one of those choices they want to make. For the woman who's carrying the baby, we have classes. We have consultations they can come to. We do classes through their 9 months of pregnancy. We do birthing classes, and we do classes 2 years after they've had that baby to help them as they begin a new life with a baby. For women who are looking at adoption, we have a list of places they can look at and contact. We don't handle adoptions ourselves there. What we really want women who come to us to know when they walk out that door is that we're there for them. We're not there to judge. We're there to extend the grace of God. We're there to extend God's love to them and let them know that we care. I volunteer at Advice and Aid because I feel like God's at work at Advice and Aid. God's at work meeting the needs of women in crisis pregnancies at Advice and Aid. And it brings me great joy and fulfillment to be there and be a part of what's going on at Advice and Aid. When women come to us in a crisis pregnancy, they have choices, and we talk about the choices. Whether they choose to carry that baby and become a parent, whether they choose to carry that baby and adopt, or whether they choose to abort that baby. We're there to support them. We're not there to judge and condemn anyone that walks in our doors.
I had another video that I wanted to share with you from one of our other members. Her name is Linda Hammondtree, and she's about the same age as Cheryl. And Linda has spent much of her life helping women at abortion clinics as they're walking through abortion for the same motivation. There are 2 women at Resurrection who love Jesus and love people and wanted to help people who were in really crisis modes, who had made the decision they were having an abortion. She's out of town, otherwise I would have interviewed her, but she sent me a note and she said, as I age, my concern for reproductive freedom focuses more on the extended families of those affected. In my prayers, I always ask for mercy and comfort for those experiencing desperate situations. You'll recall, Adam, that I shared with you years ago about the 10-year-old child who was pregnant by her father and what happened in that situation. And of course, that's an extreme, but we heard about one recently here in Indiana. She said, women are burdened with the desire to preserve their families. This complicates any personal desires. Women may recognize the fragility of their current family unit and choose to preserve it. The family may already contain a person with special needs who requires more resources and attention. The reasons to choose abortion are myriad and private. Sometimes we are stuck with the best of many bad choices in a desperate situation. I always cast my vote for reproductive freedom, thinking of all the young girls who cannot vote yet. Am I voting so that they may obtain abortion services in the future? No, I'm voting so that they might have a choice. I wanted you to hear from 2 different people from 2 very different perspectives who both cared about women and were trying to figure out how can I best help, and they both feel called to do the work they're doing. Last 2 things I'll mention. To me, it strikes me that abortion is not God's ideal will, and I think most people would agree with that, and that the unborn has value and worth, and that the woman has great value and worth, and that somehow we've got to figure out how we're supporting both and valuing both, and sometimes there are situations that seem so hard that at least for some, it's hard to find another way out aside from abortion. So some of the women who had sent me notes that I was reading last night talked about that, they were grateful for the chance to have an abortion and have their family intact. And others said, I struggled with guilt the rest of my life. And so if that's you and you happen to be here and you're struggling with guilt, can I just remind you that the Christian faith is about grace? And if you feel guilt, that God has already said, I love you and I forgive you. And as far as the east is from the west, so far shall the Lord remove your sins from you. And finally, I think, for me, the piece that has most impacted my life, so I feel a heavy heart and a great concern for women. And, I think if we're gonna have abortions, have them as early as possible in the pregnancy. And the morning after pill, I think, is really critical. And I'd love to talk more about that and don't have time. But I also wanna remind us that those babies, those unborn babies who come in really unusual and odd circumstances, grow up when they're birthed and have futures. And so this was a letter that I received some years ago. It's in the last chapter of my book, and some of you heard this letter before. It's from a parishioner. This has been now about 18 years ago, maybe longer. And she wrote and told me that she was 17 and her boyfriend was 16 when they had sex for the first time. It only took one time for her to conceive. And she told me how when her father found out about the pregnancy, he was furious. These were the days before Roe versus Wade. And so he scheduled an appointment with a doctor in Switzerland. He would fly her there for the procedure, but she refused to go, and she and the boy ended up getting married and having the baby. And she writes, my father told me I would never be welcome in the home again if I went through with the marriage and delivery of the baby. She gave up college. She gave up so much, really. She moved in with the boy's family, and the couple quickly married, and they dropped out of high school in order to have the child. And they struggled over the next few years, barely making ends meet. After 12 years, their marriage ended in divorce, and the couple's future was radically changed by their decision to have the baby. For both the woman and the man, they gave up a future they might have had in order to have this baby. And their childhood was cut short, and ultimately they divorced. So I wondered if this woman regretted her decision, but her letter concluded in this way. Yes, my life changed dramatically due to the pregnancy prior to marriage, but to this day, that child has been the greatest blessing to me and thousands of other people. God prompts him to call his mom when she needs to talk, but doesn't want to bother him. God has blessed me more with this son than I can ever imagine being blessed. I'm so proud of the husband and father that he's become. So many times when I look at him, I think that this person could have ended up aborted, but instead, due to the classes in Sunday school week after week that had been taught to me as a child, I knew that even from the moment that he was conceived, he was a gift from God. I look back sometimes at the college that I missed, the experiences that could have been, and my life is different than it could have been, but I wouldn't change it for anything. And then she writes, thank you, Adam, for being my gift from God. There can be no greater gift than that of a child that God wants to be born. I never dreamed years ago while I was carrying you that you would have the impact on God's people and me that you do. You're my pastor, my confidant, and my friend. I love you, Mom. And I share that story to say, not to overwhelm you with emotional baggage. And I know we're in all different places when it comes to abortion. But to simply remind you that sometimes those unexpected babies, when they're born, God does something surprising with them. Not really even remarkable, just sometimes surprising. And that's part of why I say I'm pro-life with a heavy heart. Because I think we have to understand and care about women who are walking through really hard situations. And there are times I look at these stories and I think, I can understand why you had an abortion. Really, I wouldn't want you to stay with a husband who was beating you, and that was your only way out. And I don't know what it's like to have 3 kids already and not be able to feed another one or figure out how I'm going to pay for childcare. And I think that the unborn matters to God too. So I'm not telling you how to vote. I'll be honest with you. I haven't voted yet, but my ballot's at home, and I have questions. And I wanted you to have at least some information as you were taking the time to decide, is this a good bill or amendment or not? I'm not sure. But I do know when it comes to abortion, we've got room to talk, and there's some gray in there. And the more we talk and the more we listen, the more we learn, the better we are at being followers of Jesus and at being authentically human towards people in hard situations. Okay, that's all we got for you tonight. And I told LaVon before I left, I said, I'm gonna really make a whole lot of people mad because people on both sides are probably gonna be unhappy, but you didn't get up and walk out yet. And I appreciate that. And you know what? I could be wrong about every single thing I told you, but all these folks gave you really good information. And I'd like to invite us to pray right now. So if you would put your hands on your lap like this, and let's just pray. And you might just whisper under your breath, God, lead me. Help me to be compassionate, empathetic, Help me to love my neighbor with whom I disagree. Help me to discern your will on how I vote. And bring us together, oh God. Make us people who love well. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. Thanks for coming tonight.